Now, as we do so many weeks here at the Daily Dose, we need to get over to our Daily Dose top 5. Every single year, the NFL is full of surprises. Just last year, the Cincinnati Bengals went all the way to the Super Bowl. No one saw that coming. Hey, look at the Philadelphia Eagles winning it all in 2017. Who had that? Besides Big Rob. Hey, we see surprises in the NFL every single year, but they aren't always good surprises. What about those bad surprises? Every single year, we see a team with some big expectations come out and then do absolutely nothing. Today, our Daily Dose Top 5 is counting down the top 5 most disappointing teams in NFL history. Hey, they had big hype going into the season. It didn't exactly turn out that way, though. We start off at number 5, and we go back to 2003, where the Oakland Raiders entered the season as the AFC's reigning champion, and they boasted the NFL's defending MVP winner in quarterback Rich Gannon. Hey, Gannon had taken the Raiders all the way to the Super Bowl. Sure, they lost to the Buccaneers in the Super Bowl, but they're bringing a lot back that year. So there's no reason to think they wouldn't be contending for a Super Bowl again, right? But here's the problem. That 2003 Raider squad, they were old. You had 38-year-old Gannon. The wide receivers, Jerry Rice, he was 41. Tim Brown was 37. And then you had the running backs, Tyrone Wheatley, Charlie Garner, and Zach Crockett. They were all 31. That once high-scoring Raider offense, they managed to score just 16 points per game in 2003. Their head coach, Bill Callahan, actually called his team the dumbest team in America, and he wasn't wrong. The Raiders averaged 8 penalties for 70 yards per game. Just giving the opponent 70 yards right off the top. Oakland went just 4-12 in 2003. They finished tied for last in the AFC West. They did earn the second pick in the NFL draft at least, right? But then they used it on very average offensive lineman Robert Gallery. The 2003 Oakland Raiders come in today on our list of disappointments at number 5. We go back to 2011 for our number 4 entry, and we arrive at a team that you probably remember if you watch much NFL, because they were actually dubbed the Dream Team by quarterback Vince Young. Well, not quite, but you could understand why he said that. That Eagle team had quite a roster. Head coach Andy Reid had Michael Vick, LaShawn McCoy, Ronnie Brown, Deshaun Jackson, Jeremy Maclin, Jason Babin, Nnamdi Asmuga, Asante Samuel, Dominique Rodgers-Cromartie. That roster was stacked. At least on paper. But you don't play games on paper. When they actually got on the field, the Eagles were okay offensively. They scored 25 points a game. They were okay on defense, allowing just 20 points per game. But again, they committed way too many penalties, and they turned the ball over way too often. 25 interceptions and 23 fumbles. That's going to be really hard to overcome, even if you are a self-proclaimed dream team. After the Eagles smacked around the St. Louis Rams in week 1, they lost 4 games in a row. And everyone said, well, it's just growing pains. It'll get better. And it did, but not by much. The Eagles finished the year winning 4 games in a row. That's pretty good. That brought their record all the way up to a whopping 8-8. The 2011 Philadelphia Eagles Dream Team lost as much as they won, and that puts them on our list today at number 4. We move on to number 3, and we go back to the year 2000. Following a 10-6 season, Washington owner Daniel Snyder made his team the league's first ever $100 million roster payroll. Hey, if you spend big money, you get big results, right? So Washington went out and they signed veteran stars like Bruce Smith, Mark Carrier, Deion Sanders, Jeff George. Sure, they were all way past their prime, but who cares? Snyder was going to show people how to build a dream team. He knows how to do this if anyone does, right? He also went out and he drafted LeVar Arrington. He drafted Chris Samuels with the second and third picks in the NFL draft. But again, you don't win games on paper. The Washington offense was led not by Jeff George, but by a very average Brad Johnson at quarterback. They scored just 17 points per game, and Johnson threw 11 touchdowns, but had 15 interceptions. After a loss in Week 14 to the New York Giants by a crazy score of 9-7, that dropped their record to 7-6 on the year, and Snyder fired head coach Norv Turner. Maybe that'll spark this team to make a playoff run. Yeah, it didn't. Washington finished the season 8-8. They missed the playoffs completely. And now looking back, this was all kind of a hint of what was going to be coming with Daniel Snyder. And we found out it would mostly be dysfunctional. Daniel Snyder and Washington circa 2000 come in today at number 3. We arrive at the number 2 most disappointing team, and we reach a team that looked like they were on the verge of doing something like impossible. This is going to sound insane when I say this, but the Cleveland Browns had gone to the NFL playoffs 5 years in a row from 1985 until 1989. In fact, they went clear to the AFC Championship game in 3 of those 5 years. And they had come so sickeningly close to winning it all and going to a Super Bowl. Unfortunately for Cleveland, a guy by the name of John Elway was born. But Bernie Kosar and the Browns dominated much of the late 80s. So even after they lost again to the Broncos in 1989, there was hope. Maybe Cleveland will come back in 1990 and challenge yet again. But for some reason, when they flipped the calendar to the 90s, everything changed. Because the 1990 Cleveland Browns were a major disappointment in a town mostly known for disappointments. Bud Carson had actually taken over the head coaching job for Marty Schottenheimer in '89. But when the Browns started the season by getting whipped 34-0 by the Kansas City Chiefs in Week 4, then they lost 42-0 to the Buffalo Bills in Week 9, the Browns went ahead and fired Carson too. Again, it didn't help. They were shut out 3 times that season. And in Week 14, the Houston Oilers beat the Browns 58-14. Kosar threw 5 more interceptions than touchdowns. And here's the really sad part about it. Things were never the same in Cleveland. And then eventually, there was no more Cleveland. Because that era ended. And just 5 years later, Browns owner Art Modell would pack up the team and move them to Baltimore. Got a more disappointing season than that? It's not going to be easy. But the 1990 Cleveland Browns come in today on our list at number 2. Okay, so when I tell you the number 1 team on our list, you might disagree, and I completely understand. But hear me out. Because if I told you that our number 1 team rolled to a 14-2 record, you'd say, come on, Clint. That hardly sounds like a disappointing season. But again, hear me out. Let me ask you this, Daly Dose listener. If I were to ask you to name the greatest team in NFL history, what would you say? Maybe you'd say the Green Bay Packers of the 60s. Maybe you'd say the 70s Pittsburgh Steelers, who were amazing. The San Francisco 49ers of the 80s and the 90s. They were incredible. Maybe you would say the Patriots of the 2000s. But without a doubt, one of the most dominant teams in NFL history was the 1985 Chicago Bears. The Bears defense, that is maybe the greatest defense in history. They allowed just 12 points per game. You had guys like Richard Dent and Steve McMichael and Mike Singletary and Wilbur Marshall and Otis Wilson. They didn't just beat people. They abused you and literally scared opponents. Quarterbacks quit games. They faked injuries to get out of the game. Now, the offense wasn't great, but with Walter Payton and Jim McMahon and Willie Gault, they were still very dangerous. The 85 Bears went 15-1. They rolled easily to a Super Bowl win. And get this, in the playoffs that year, they won their 2 playoff games and then the Super Bowl by a combined score of 101-10. So, in 1986, they come back off that season. They're going to do it again, right? They jump out to a 6-0 record, but this team wasn't quite the same. For one, Jim McMahon showed up all fat and sloppy, and the defense wasn't quite as dominant. They weren't quite as hungry. They got blown out 23-7 by the Minnesota Vikings in Week 7. Okay. 2 weeks later, they lost to the Los Angeles Rams. But it was in Week 12 that this season went downhill fast, because playing the Green Bay Packers, McMahon throws a pass downfield. He's just walking down the field when Packers defensive lineman Charles Martin picks McMahon up and slams him down on his shoulder, blowing his rotator cuff and ending his season. Now, when that happened, NFL referee Jerry Markbright, he was actually standing right there. He saw the play happen right in front of him. And he told Martin, 94, you're out of the game. I'm ejecting you. But Martin pulls away and says, I'm not going anywhere with you. Markbright told him, he says, if you don't come with me, I'm going to let the rest of this Bears team kill you. Martin said, well, let's go. That was it for the Bears, though. Without McMahon, they weren't the same. Mike Tomczak and Steve Fuller, they couldn't play like McMahon could play. They just weren't the same. The Bears did go 14-2. They still made the playoffs, but then they got beaten 27-14 by Washington. And the Bears dynasty, a dynasty of exactly one, was over. The 85 Bears, without question, were one of the greatest teams ever. The 86 Bears went 14-2, and yet somehow they were one of the biggest disappointments ever. Hey, expectations this year in the NFL, they're really high for a few teams. You think about teams we talked about, like Buffalo, Kansas City, Green Bay. The Los Angeles Rams are the defending champs. The Los Angeles Chargers have big expectations. And maybe all these teams live up to those expectations. Maybe they're all contenders. Or maybe they add their name to this list of disappointments too. And in a few years, we're talking about them and remembering that year that they just didn't quite live up to the hype. Okay, YouTube, make sure you go over and check out the rest of the podcast, because this week on The Dose, we are reviewing the first full week of football. We look at what we learned this week in college football, as well as what we see as some of the biggest overreactions to week 1 of the NFL. Plus, we have some news stories you're going to want to hear. So be sure you listen to the full podcast. I will leave a link here in the comments on YouTube for you. Hope y'all are doing well. I will see you all next Wednesday. Have a great week.